Hello, I'm Mr. Eliason, and welcome to World History. Today we're going to continue moving past World War I to look at the effect of the Great Conflict on areas around the world. So for today, our lesson is about the Warlord era in China. So let's dive in and tell our narrative. Here's our objectives for today. Take a moment, pause, and make sure you understand them. And then we'll give a brief recap of how we've got here in China and what this means for the Chinese moving forward. As you hopefully remember, the Qing dynasty collapsed because of its failures of modernization and the increasing pressure of foreign encroachment, both from European powers and, of course, from the Japanese. The Chinese are still struggling to create this modern society that we've been talking about and figuring out what elements of foreign and quote unquote modern culture they want to incorporate and how they incorporate that into traditional Chinese thought. So, these are the challenges that China faces in the warlord period as China goes through one of its historic eras of disunity, with many attempts from different groups to attempt to unify China again. So, the warlord period is, again, a period of disunity. You've got China divided up into these various spheres of influence, each one controlled by a various Chinese warlord who is backed by a foreign power or simply pledging like ostensible fealty to the Kuomintang government in Beijing, while in practice basically ruling themselves. The warlord era is one of the weirder, more colorful eras in Chinese history. You've got the Manchurian warlord sort of up in the north, who's following very traditional Manchurian customs and trying to pretend like the Qing dynasty is still going on. You've got the Christian warlord who's spending his time, baptizing his troops with a fire hose and trying to bring in some sort of, Chinese versions of Christianity. You've got Zhang Zhongchang here, who he travels around in his own private rail car, basically living life to what he would consider the fullest, composing weird poetry and using a variety of different substances to alter his mental state. If you're interested in him, man, he is a colorful figure. These Chinese warlords are unique and strange. One of the effects of this is it created an actual period of spectacular economic, technological, and cultural growth in China. The collapse of Qing central authority meant that all of these sort of foreign concepts and foreign technologies flooded into China in a spectacularly short period of time. Chinese people embraced Western products, Western dresses, Western technology, bringing in automobiles, movie theaters, things like that. Chinese cities, especially along the coast, grew pretty substantially. And there were huge economic opportunities for Chinese people to invest in foreign markets, to connect China to the global economy in a way that we hadn't seen before. It's a weird period where, although there's no powerful central Chinese government, there's a ton going on in China and a lot of opportunities for both Chinese and non Chinese people to embrace this brave new world. The Song family, Charles Song here, are one of the examples of how Chinese families sort of evolved and adapted to this new world. He's going to become a spectacularly wealthy Chinese industrialist, and the Song sisters are going to be some of the central players in our story, although generally just below the sort of surface of the narrative. So Sung Ailing is going to marry H. Kung, who's one of the wealthiest men in China, and is going to be this sort of the J.P. Morgan of China, I guess, would be the closest analog for our American audiences, and going to be involved in everything, and so she's going to be super famous. We also get Sung Qingling is going to marry Sun Yat-sen and be one of the people pushing this sort of movement for Chinese nationalism. And then Sun Meiling is going to marry Chiang Kai-shek and be sort of the first lady of the Chinese Nationalist Party in the aftermath of Sun Yat-sen's death. And so the Sung family is going to be an example of modernization. The Sung sisters are going to represent sort of this new era in Chinese history. And we're really going to see Chinese culture grow and adapt to all of these foreign influences and all of these foreign pressures. At the same time, you're going to see spectacular instability as these various warlords fight for territory throughout China. You're going to see constant warfare between the various states, drafting young men into the army and fighting sort of along the borders of their territory, with everyone's goal, again, being trying to unify China again. Sort of during these traditional periods of Chinese disunity, the goal is always to reunify the Chinese state. And so we're going to see massive armies traveling around doing this, both controlling territory, or in the case of, some warlords, again, just traveling around on their private rail cars with their private armies, enforcing and trying to control areas and, more or less extorting people. All of this disorder eventually leads to movements to try to unify China. The Manifesto of the Students of Beijing is one of the more important sort of testimonies here. So take a moment and pause to read this. Obviously, the calls to unite China are relatively strong, and this is one of the important movements, and especially the students' movement in Beijing is part of the May 4th movement. The May 4th movement is one of the most important movements in modern Chinese history. It involves, again, mostly university students in Beijing rising up, demanding change from the government, and looking for various sort of ways to get their ideas across. And eventually it's going to morph into sort of a proto-workers slash peasants slash communist movement. They're also going to create a series of newspapers in order to get their ideas out. We're going to see the use of traditional big character posters to sort of spread and disseminate ideas. And during this time period, we're going to get the growth of a new Chinese culture as a part of this, especially the adoption of simplified Chinese characters, which make literacy much more accessible for the average Chinese person. Chinese, as you hopefully know, is a spectacularly complex language with, it's a pictographic written language with, hundreds of thousands of different characters. But simplified Chinese has many fewer characters, making it much more accessible for the average person. And so that's going to lead to a significant increase in the dissemination of information and the ability to spread ideas across China. Eventually, one of the ideas that takes hold is the Chinese Communist Party, which the Chinese are going to bring in. Part of traveling around during World War I was Chinese people going abroad and exploring new ideas. One of the places they traveled was the Soviet Union, and you're going to see a lot of Chinese people, a lot of sort of educated Chinese people adopting communism as a potential alternate method of modernization to the capitalism that was sort of ruling the warlords and the Roaring Twenties. One of the most important people in this movement is an assistant librarian at Peking University named Mao Zedong, who's going to be a really important figure in our study going forward. There's obviously a lot of other Chinese communists besides Mao who are very important, but we're not going to spend a ton of time on them just for time's sake. But if you're interested in the early foundations of the Chinese Communist Party, definitely dive in and spend time doing this. Mao's thought is eventually going to become central. He's not very important to the early founding of the party, but because he becomes such a central figurehead moving forward, we're going to read some of his early stuff. So here's The Peasants of Hunan by Mao. Take a moment, pause, and read. Some of the ideas of the Chinese communists are going to differ from the Soviets because the Soviets were a somewhat industrialized state, and the Soviet movement, or at least the Russian communist movement, grew out of the workers of Petrograd for the most part, and of course the intellectuals. In China, you don't have this large working class, and so the Chinese communists are going to instead focus on mobilizing the peasants, which are sort of the common people, or begin to be seen as the proletariat of the Chinese Communist Party. So they're going to appeal to the peasants, with the idea being if they can push policies like land reform, this is going to bring peasants on board. The Chinese communists are, of course, going to have the advantage of aid from the Russians, especially as Joseph Stalin begins solidifying his control in the aftermath of Lenin's death in 1924. I know in this class we haven't yet talked about Lenin's death, but believe me, we'll get there. Lenin's going to die. Spoilers, Stalin's going to take over. And we're going to see this era of somewhat cooperation between the Chinese communists and the Russians, which is going to be, again, it's going to be a complicated relationship that we're going to spend a lot of time on going forward here. So the Kuomintang is going to be only controlling very sort of southern areas. In general, they're going to be supported. It's going to be a union of nationalists and communists. And the communists have the added benefit of Soviet support. And they're really only going to be controlling this sort of southern area around China, around the city that used to be Canton in Guangdong province here, and sort of these southern areas. The death of Sun Yat-sen is going to lead to a breakdown in the unity between Chinese communists and Chinese nationalists, especially with the rise of Chiang Kai-shek. So with the rise of Chiang Kai-shek, the Chinese nationalists are going to really try to take over the Kuomintang and force the Chinese communists out. The era of unity that they had hoped for under Sun Yat-sen is really short-lived because Sun never really got a significant amount of time to control the Chinese Communist Party. Of course, the Chinese Nationalist Party. This propaganda is, of course, from from Taiwan, which we're going to talk about at some point here. Zhang is going to take military control over the KMT, or the Kuomintang. He's going to substantially increase their power using a combination of communist support and also some other foreign aid, and is going to start slowly pushing back against these warlords and expanding the power of the Chinese nationalist government to take this whole sort of central area of China. From there, he's going to start launching what's called the Northern Expedition against these warlords, a massive sweeping campaign across northern China, eventually bringing the vast majority of Chinese territory under Kuomintang control. And so the Chinese nationalists and this Republic of China are going to take over some significant territory here with the support of the masses of the Chinese people who both want to see order restored and also want to see China, these warlords sort of removed from power. So the Northern Expedition is spectacularly successful, cutting down on the power of these various groups and pushing these warlords out. And so here we can see the campaign to take the northern city of Beijing, which eventually they do. And then with that, we've got the declaration of a standard Republic of China. And from there, Zhang reveals his true colors. His Republic of China is theoretically going to be a democratically elected government, but we're never really going to see free elections. And Zhang is going to start viewing the Chinese communists as a potential threat to his power. And so as he finishes solidifying power over a lot of China, he's eventually going to turn on the communists. So here's Zhou Enlai's story of Chiang Kai-shek turning on the communists, taking away sort of communist ideas, trying to squash communist propaganda, because he was worried that the communists would provide a second, a threat to his power. The biggest example of this is the Shanghai Massacre, in which Chiang Kai-shek joins together with a variety of different sort of gangsters and warlords known as the Green Gang, who had, in order to suppress the workers' movement in Shanghai. Young communists like young Zhou Enlai here had been going to sort of mobilize the workers of Shanghai. And for Zhang, this represented a problem because he needed the economic might of the sort of wealthy corporations in those areas. And so he's joining together with gangsters like Big Ear Du here in order to massacre communists and try to purge the KMT of their communist influences. So here's the Shanghai Massacre. Pause, move forward. With the absolute destruction of the communists in Shanghai, Zhang then moves to start purging communists from other areas of the country. His army turns on communists and workers, arresting Chinese communist leaders, and kicking off a struggle for power between nationalists and communists that's going to continue all the way until 1949. This white terror leads to the execution of a significant number of communists, the exile of other communist leaders, and huge massacres of workers as KMT troops attempt to suppress this popular movement. And the communists have to start going underground, resorting to guerrilla tactics, setting up their own sort of local Soviets, these sort of isolated areas of control, in order to survive in the face of these massive assaults. In order to survive, the Chinese communists create what's called the People's Liberation Army, with Mao famously saying that the Revolutionary War is a war of the masses. The people themselves must rise up. And so they're going to begin a combination of guerrilla tactics and setting up sort of secret bases and enclaves in order to keep the movement going against the strength of the KMT. In order to make sure that they don't alienate the people and they constantly have an ocean to hide in, as Mao put it, here's his 3 rules and 8 points of people's warfare. So take a moment, pause, and read. By treating the peasants well, Mao is going to build popular support amongst the peasants. And so even though Chiang Kai-shek is going to launch massive encirclement campaigns, trying to drive out these Soviets and these communists, These encirclement campaigns were somewhat successful at driving out the communists, but they took substantial resources and significantly weakened the power of the Chinese nationalists because many of their resources were being used in order to fight against these communists, and then the Japanese slammed into the Chinese. After staging a bombing, what's called the Mukden incident, the Japanese started to argue that the Chinese did not have control over their northern territories. We're going to talk more about this from the Japanese standpoint, but the Japanese argued that this bombing demonstrated that there was so much disorder in China that the Japanese needed to move in and establish control. So they invaded Manchuria, drove the nationalists out, set up Puyi, the last emperor of the Qing dynasty, who abdicated at the age of 4 as a puppet ruler of the territory of Manchukuo, and northern China became a Japanese protectorate. The Chinese communists went into exile, led by Mao. Mao led his troops on the famed Long March into Yunnan province here, and this was a way to keep the Chinese communist movement alive. With nationalist troops hot on their trail, they had this incredibly long sort of journey across difficult terrain until eventually they were able to find a place of safety. And from there, the Chinese communists would remobilize and launch attacks mostly against the Japanese to try to take back significant parts of northern China. We'll talk about this again more from the Japanese perspective going forward here. But we'll leave China here, with the Chinese nationalists being pushed back by the Japanese, the communists in their hidden mountain enclaves, and the Japanese controlling significant portions of northern China. So that's our story for now. We'll move back to Europe and talk about the aftermath of World War I for Germany next time. But for now, thank you for listening.